If you ask any caster in esports to summarize, to define the job of a caster, you're probably going to get something along the same sort of answer from most casters. Casters are storytellers. Our job is to tell the story of the game. But that can be pretty complicated, right? Unlike authors, we don't get to write all of the events. We don't get to plan ahead and know exactly what's going to happen. We don't get to go back and edit things once we've said them. So it can be pretty difficult to actually fall into this niche of a storyteller in the way that we have to live on air. Something I've found in my own limited experience is that while we are storytellers, and while every caster you talk to will acknowledge and probably be excited to tell you that they are a storyteller for esports, it can be interesting the lack of purposeful integration of narrative tools despite that, right? If you want to be a writer, you learn about creative writing. You learn about all of the tools available to a writer. You don't necessarily use them all, but you should be aware that they are there. Casting, I find, is a very interesting field for professionals because we're all self-taught. And in a field where everyone is so self-taught, I find a lot of casters go off their intuition rather than sitting down and being purposeful in how they conduct their craft. Now, it's not inherently wrong to do things intuitively. I think there are a lot of great casters, and I don't know if they've ever sat down, and I mean, you see the title of the video, and thought about how the hero's journey relates in depth to the story of esports. I doubt that every really good caster has sat down and done this. But I think it's important to take some time as casters and think to ourselves, what are different things that we could incorporate? What are different ways that we could improve our craft? So this is going to be the first in hopefully a series of videos that I want to do called my considerations in casting, where I sort of just talk about different tools that I think are available to us. And while casting is extremely subjective, everybody's going to have different opinions on every single caster in the world. There are certain objective tools available to us as casters. What tools you choose to use is just, your own personal flavor a lot of the time. But I think it's important to at least know the tools are there and to think about them and, again, to be cognizant of them. So, with that being said, let's start the first consideration in casting and talk a little bit about the hero's journey. So the first thing we have to do is define the hero's journey, right? For anyone who doesn't know what the hero's journey is, it's essentially this idea that the vast majority of, if not the entirety of stories told in literature or film fall into this sort of framework, right? We start with the ordinary world, the status quo. Then there's a call to adventure that beckons us to leave the ordinary world. The hero refuses the call because of their insecurities or their fears, or they're tied to the ordinary world, but then they meet a mentor that guides them into the special world, and they finally cross the threshold. Then they have a series of tests. They gain allies, they gain enemies, etc., until they approach the inner cave, which is basically the lead up to the climax of the story, which happens sort of around the ordeal and seizing the reward. The ordeal is the big part of the story where it's like, oh my god, this is the hardest thing you have to do, and then finally you've done it. You get the reward, you go back home, and you fix everything, and the status quo is now better forever. That's a very intense summary of the hero's journey. I'm going to put a link down in the description that goes much more in depth on it. It's an article that I used that I referenced very heavily when sort of talking about this and theorizing how this could relate to esports. So I encourage you to go read all of that if you're not already familiar with the hero's journey in more depth. But this is the sort of framework that we're going to be discussing today, and how this framework can translate to esports narratives. Perfect. So now we're vaguely familiar with the hero's journey, right? What is it? It's a narrative framework for analyzing and understanding mythic tales of heroism. Here's just a list of a bunch of different popular stories you've probably seen that follow the hero's journey. And here's just a little bit more of an explanation. This document that I'm using here is also going to be down in the video description if you want to take a look at it later and in more depth. But let's talk now how we can translate the hero's journey into esports. Because I think when a lot of people look at esports and they think about teams and they think about players, for a lot of fans, these teams, these players, they are heroes. Especially, you think of big international events, you think at the stakes of, when you're the last team from your country, or you're the only player from this region of the world, or something like that, right? Those are extreme examples, but I think every player in every team is the protagonist of their own story. And as casters in esports, as storytellers, we have to do them justice. So the first thing we have to understand is that there are multiple kinds of stories that we tell in esports, right? That's one of the reasons it's so complex and often subjective is, we don't just tell one story of one person doing one thing like you would in the traditional hero's journey. You think of Star Wars, yeah, there's a lot of different characters. Every character gets their own growth, but A New Hope is about Luke's journey, right? We don't have that luxury. We tell the story of dozens of players, over 10 teams in a season most of the time, right? And how they all clash against each other. So the first thing we have to understand is that players and teams will be their own protagonist, but also we have the story of each individual game, each individual series, and each season, right? Or each tournament, depending on what your format looks like. So you have to consider not only these smaller narratives, these specific narratives, but also how these smaller narratives relate to the giant narrative that you are trying to tell throughout the entire season, throughout the entire series, etc. So a lot of the time during this breakdown, I'm going to break it into both examples for some smaller narratives, when we're talking about individual games or series, and then some larger ones when we're talking about the season. So we start with the ordinary world. We start with the status quo. This, for a season, would be walking in and saying, hello, welcome to the new season. Here's how things stand at the beginning. Here's what our season looks like. Here are the teams that we expect to do really well. Here are the players that we're really excited to see, right? Here's who's probably going to do well and who might struggle a bit. This is our framework for how the story will change later. Things to consider here obviously are, histories of the teams and players, who's won previously, who's lost a lot previously. It gets complicated, especially the higher up you go and the more you know about players and teams, the more you have to integrate tons of histories into all of this. But the ordinary world is essentially just us at the beginning of the day or at the beginning of the season, giving the audience how things stand currently. Then our second step is, of course, the call to adventure. This is where the teams and the players are going to be challenged to change the status quo. This is where you as a caster set the stakes for your series or for your season. What are these teams playing for? What is the purpose of this game? What happens when the outcome of this game is decided? How does that change our status quo, or maybe even not change it too much, right? Depending on how things play out. And who is going to be our more so protagonists comparatively? Again, keeping in mind that every player and team is a protagonist, but some will perform well and some won't. We're going to come back to that a little bit later as well and talk more about the butting heads of different narratives and how you have to be considerate of them all. The third thing we have to discuss is the refusal of the call. Now, traditionally, in the hero's journey, the refusal of the call is somewhat literal, right? The hero says, no, I don't want to go on the adventure. I don't want to do that. I have to keep doing what I'm doing. I have to stay in the ordinary world. Obviously, in esports, it's not going to be that literal because the players and teams are all very excited to answer the call to adventure. And this was the part that stumped me for a long time when I was considering the hero's journey and its relation to telling esports narratives. But after looking into the purpose of the refusal of the call, it can still very easily translate to esports. You see here, I've taken an excerpt from, again, that article I'm going to link in the description. A hero refuses the journey because of fears and insecurities that have surfaced from the call to adventure. The hero is not willing to make changes, preferring the safe haven of the ordinary world. So most teams are going to answer the call, but the purpose of the refusal is so that we can highlight fears and insecurities. So when we think about the refusal of the call in relation to esports, they don't have to refuse the call. We just have to bring up what our fears and what the insecurities and what the flaws of our protagonists are, or what they might be, right? Maybe this team is too aggressive. Maybe X player has never gotten past second place before. How is he going to be able to do it this time, right? This is in esports where you are setting room for improvement. This is your concerns as a broadcaster. This is where you highlight potential flaws so that you can call back to them later when they are or maybe aren't relevant. The next portion that we go into is meeting the mentor. In esports, sometimes this is literal, right? Sometimes you'll have like a bunch of rookies on a team with a veteran, and that veteran is like sort of the mentor that's going to carry the rookies from being rookies to being a team worth their salt. Or they'll have a really experienced coach or something like that, right? But we can also look at this as just ways that players and teams are given resources to improve, right? The purpose of the mentor is to help transition the protagonist into the special world. And then finally in our Act 1, we cross the threshold. For esports, this is when we get into the game, right? This is, all right, we've set up everything. We've given you your exposition, audience. Now we play. Next, we move into Act 2, our in-game or in-season narratives, right? So the first thing up is tests, allies, and enemies. This is a large portion of our story, but it also gets breezed over in the framework because the point is simply to advance the story further, right? To give obstacles to our hero for them to overcome on their way to the biggest obstacle they'll face in the story. So referencing esports and thinking about this game-oriented, right? So in a single game, if we're transcribing the hero's journey into it, these are the skirmishes, the trading of objectives, small team fights that build the stakes for later, that get us to our end game. In terms of a season, this is where most of your games are going to be, right? Most of your games in an individual season are going to lie in this category. Not everything is an elimination game. So your average games, roster changes, things like that, those are going to be tests, allies, and enemies, your sixth step. Then we approach the innermost cave. This is our breath, our moment taken before the biggest ordeal of the story. So as a caster in esports, this is where we set the stakes of the ordeal. This is when we're approaching the critical fight, like in League of Legends, a Baron fight or an Elder Dragon fight. In Valorant, a swing round toward the end of the game when both teams are at like 11-11 and one team is running out of economy. This is in a regular season or in a season where we discuss the stakes of pivotal matches. Oh, whoever wins this is going to get first seed, or oh, whoever wins this gets a ticket to the grand final and the other team goes to the lower bracket, right? This is setting the stakes for the ordeal. And then the eighth step, our ordeal, is pretty self-explanatory. This is the moment where everything changes. In a game, it's the fight that determines the game. And in a season, it's those moments that alter the course, whether those are elimination games or massive alterations in the standings. Obviously, finals, grand finals is going to be the ordeal once you actually get there. In a season, there are multiple ordeals, though, for different teams and players, but this is the climax of the story where everything changes. Our ninth step is immediately post the ordeal. The hero has seized the reward. So again, using League of Legends as a reference, they won the Baron fight. They have the Baron buff. They're pushing for the end of the game. One of our heroes has survived the ordeal and gained a boon because of it. The point of seizing the reward is that this is our moment of celebration after a team wins the pivotal fight, after they survive the ordeal, and we can see how this reward will affect the ordinary world, the status quo from before. Then we get to our third act, right? The post-game or post-season, or at the very least, the very end of the game. The road back home does still take place in-game. This is where the team closes out the game, right? They have the reward, they've survived the ordeal, now they just have to finish the game out, or finish the season out. This can be a little bit tricky, and this is where you have to stay on your toes as a caster, because in esports, again, if we're writing a story, this just closes out most of the time. Boom, road back home, we're done. But in esports, there's always a slim chance that even the team that won what you thought was going to be the ordeal, and they should be able to close the game out, sometimes the other team has a crazy comeback or keeps themselves alive longer than you thought. So you have to keep on your toes when it comes to these 4 steps and be aware that they can often change or rotate, or you can loop back to them, right? Oh, this should have been the game-winning fight. This should have been the ordeal. But on the road back home, the team with the reward wasn't able to actually close the game out. So now we're going to have another fight, and we approach the even innermost cave, if that makes sense. So this is somewhere where in esports, the hero's journey doesn't translate in perfect order 100% of the time. Eventually, though, one team will complete the road back home, and they'll get to the resurrection or atonement, right? Now, again, we're not going to have a little resurrection. At least I hope we don't on stage. So we have to kind of look at what the purpose of the resurrection and the atonement is. And I pulled another passage from that same article that I'm going to be linking in the description. The ordeal and resurrection represent a cleansing or purification that must occur now that the hero has emerged from the land of the dead. Essentially, this is where we as broadcasters reframe and restate how we got here and what changed for us to get here. How have our players and teams adapted? What did they overcome to achieve their goal? We tie back into the refusal of the call, test allies and enemies, and the ordeal. What was the road? What were the changes? What is our, for lack of a better word, character progression for our teams and players that got them here? And then finally, the return with the elixir, the final resolution and the change to the status quo. The player or team has accomplished their goal and improved the status quo, at least for themselves. These are like post-game moments most of the time. It'll, be in interviews, or if you're on an online broadcast, caster cams or the analyst desk, or moments where after the game, when we're calming down our denouement, right? This is where we hark back to why this game was important. What changed? What was so critical about this game or this series or this season? What did all of it mean, and why was it important? Of course, along all of this, we do have to keep in mind that this is esports and it's not a novel or a film, right? The hero's journey doesn't even translate into every novel or film perfectly, much less esports, where, again, we don't determine what the events are. We don't sit down and write a script, despite, the jokes a lot of us casters will make about the script of a season. So there are things that we have to consider in terms of how the hero's journey relates to esports and where it isn't necessarily a perfect fit for every single narrative. The first thing I want to talk about is I've used the term status quo a lot today, and there are certain changes when we think about the ordinary world and the special world of the traditional hero's journey versus the status quo in esports. In a novel or film, we would have complete control over this, and a complete story would change the status quo entirely. But sometimes you walk into a tournament and the team that everyone expected to win wins. And it wasn't that hard. Sometimes that happens. But even then, I personally would argue there are edits to the status quo. Oh, this just goes to show how dominant X team is. They're going to keep winning and keep doing this. This is more proof that they're amazing, right? Something along those lines. But also not every story is going to be as important in terms of like individual games. There's a very clear difference in the narrative weight of like a grand final between two rival teams from two rival regions that determines X, Y, and Z forever versus, oh, look, the team that was undefeated beat the team that hasn't won a match. Those aren't the same game. They don't have the same weight to them, the same importance to them. And that's why in esports, you have to continuously adapt. Another thing I want to discuss is completing the hero's journey. I said, toward the beginning of our walk through the framework here, every player and team is a protagonist. But when we think about a season or we think about a series, the completion of the hero's journey is returning with the elixir. Not every team gets to do that. Not every team wins. In fact, most of the time, it's only one team in a series or in a season that actually gets to complete the hero's journey. Teams will be eliminated. Rosters will change. Players will get subbed out and benched. So again, there's a lot of adaptation that we have to consider. And sometimes, well, in a particular season, only one team will fully complete the hero's journey. We most of the time have another season. At the end of a traditional hero's journey, the characters stop existing. The characters don't go on and do other things. We presume they live forever in the changed ordinary world. But here in esports, players and teams don't stop existing at the end of the game or at the end of the season, right? They will keep going on. Their journey continues. And this is where we have to recognize the cyclical nature. You'll notice from this graphic I used at the very beginning, oh, look, end to start. Wonder why that is. Because the hero's journey often is cyclical. And when we get sequels and we get prequels, right, of stories, past heroes' journeys incorporate into future ones. And the final thing I want to consider is an argument that was actually brought up when I was talking about the hero's journey on Twitter by an amazing caster and someone I've worked with in Contenders Korea, Pixie. I think Pixie actually has a literary degree too, so he probably knows more than me. But he brings up a good point that the hero's journey is not meant to actually fit every story. Some people will argue that it does, right? Another name for the hero's journey is the monomyth, the idea that it does follow every story. I don't know if I agree with that personally. And even then, even if I did agree with it, it just becomes hard to adapt into an on-broadcast narrative for everything to always fit all 12 steps of the hero's journey at every single point. And this is where we have to think of the hero's journey not as a monomyth, not as a must-have framework for every second of the broadcast, but as a tool. The hero's journey, I think, is something important to keep in mind when we as casters are building our narratives, because our job is not only to tell the story, but to tell the story in a way where the audience connects with it. And the hero's journey is a good tool in order to frame our narrative so that the audience can very clearly understand the steps of the journey that we are going. Obviously, when I'm casting, I'm not going to say, hey, folks, welcome to this. Let's talk about the ordinary world. Okay, cool. Now it's time for the call to adventure. That's not how we use it, right? But a natural implementation of it is good for how we choose to frame narrative. But again, one of the tricky things about using the hero's journey is we have to stay on our toes. I've said several times throughout this video at this point, but I'm going to say it one more time. We don't determine what happens in these games. We don't determine if team A or B wins Baron fight, or if team X or Z swings at the right time and peaks the enemy player. We don't determine what abilities are used. We just see them. We interpret them. And that is our job, is interpreting the narrative of esports. So I think the hero's journey is an important tool to keep in mind, but it's not a tell-all. You're still the storyteller, and it's your job to make sure that not only the audience understands the story, but that you do the players and the teams justice on each of their heroes' journeys. We as casters are storytellers. We use narrative tools, even if we're not consciously aware of it, even if it isn't purposeful, right? A common tool in use by casters is something called shelving, where we bring out an idea that might be important later and then shelve it. That's just foreshadowing. The hero's journey finds its way into esports. Whether casters are cognizant of it or not, they use it. But I think it can be important. I think it is important to tell our stories with purpose. To tell the stories of the players in a way that matters, not only to those players, not only that is respectful and representative of the people who put everything into this esport scene that we love, but also to the fans, to the audience members, to the ones who receive our stories and hopefully are impacted positively by them.